Good morning, or I heard a good afternoon, and of course for some it's good evening. Welcome to day 2 of our May board sessions. I thank everyone for coming back. Today the topic is going concern. Josephine is gonna lead the session on behalf of the going concern working group. Much like the fraud paper we went through the other day, or I guess it's a few weeks ago, that the purpose of this is to continue to refine our focus based upon our research and information gathering activities on whether there is standard setting that we could do usefully in response to concerns or ongoing concern. So we have a really good agenda paper, agenda item 5. And we will devote our next 3 hours to going through it and really focusing on what we can do usefully to address any concerns raised in the public interest. And I really emphasize that. I said that yesterday at the close of the meeting. What can we do that's in our control, if that's necessary, to improve public confidence in reporting information? So Josephine, I turn it to you right now to lead us through the agenda item. I look forward to a really good discussion. Remember, the idea is not to solve all the issues, but to filter the issues for what a potential project or approach could be to going concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And that's right. We're all inclined to want to solve problems immediately, but remain open-minded. And this is about possible actions and exploration. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest installment of Going Concern. Before we kick off, I would, of course, like to thank our amazing staff. Bev, of course, who had a lot to do with this at the beginning, and then she was stolen from us to the fraud side. Brett, who stepped in to support us, and of course to Angela, who has been doing so much of the hard work in the scenes and behind the scenes. And I'll be looking to Angela if there are any really tricky questions that come up. So Angela, stay alert. Thank you. Also, I'd like to thank Kalina and Dan and the audit reporting group, because of course they did help us pull together the comments from the survey that we have in the issues paper. And without doubt, I would like to thank the marvelous working group, who I keep occasionally calling the task force. So just forgive me if I do keep slipping into that phraseology. We have on our working group Ado, Isabel, Renee, Susan, and Wendy, and without whom we wouldn't be able to pull together these great papers today. And a little thank you to our fellow standard setting colleagues who would ordinarily be at the IAASB NSS meeting right now and have chosen Going Concern instead. I really appreciate your commitment to this important topic. Next slide, please. So what are the objectives? So the objectives of today's session, and similar to fraud, of course, is to give you an overview of the feedback from the discussion paper in order to obtain your views on the possible direction and matters identified. And then, of course, the purpose of this is to identify and prioritise those matters that should be considered in a project proposal. It's not my intention to talk, I mentioned this yesterday, it's not my intention to talk through each of the matters in detail at all. We certainly don't have the time, and the board will of course be aware of the comprehensive information that's in the issues paper. But we use the time instead, of course, to get your feedback, which is important for these next steps. I will, of course, give a little bit of flavour as we move along. Next slide, please. So our going concern is very much ahead now in the information gathering and research phase of our framework for activities. And this slide illustrates that, similar to fraud, the issues paper includes the comprehensive feedback that we've heard from the discussion paper. And of course, it includes all the other information activities. So our proposals for a way forward are not just based on the evidence from the discussion paper, but of course the information that we receive from those information gathering activities, including the auditor reporting survey. So a little just recap, really. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then next slide again, actually, please. I mean, we have seen these before in April, but those slides are just letting us know that we received 85 letters from across the globe, and of course from different respondents. And we also, as I say, did get some, I didn't say, I don't think, but I might have mentioned previously that some respondents also pointed to some academic research that they'd actually performed as well. And so we were able to incorporate that into our work too. So next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So this is a summary of the public interest issues that we put together in paragraph 15 of the issues paper. Now, I'm not going to cover these in detail because we're actually going to work through each of the matters that fit under these particular categories as we will go through the slides. We did draw on our experience in summarizing the public interest matters from other project proposals, but we would actually like to hear from the board as we talk through the possible actions as to whether the board believes that these are the right public interest matters, if there are others, and whether we've actually categorized everything correctly, if that's the case. It's starting to get into the meat of things now. Next slide, please. And then the next slide. So we did ask the question, of course, what are the causes of the expectation gap? And responses to this question were actually very positive, with respondents noting that the 3-component framework was, of course, helpful in understanding the issues. Now, some respondents did note that the knowledge gap was a primary driver of the expectations gap, but not only in relation to auditors' responsibilities, but also in relation to management's responsibilities. That said, though, when enhancements or solutions were suggested, respondents thoughtfully did not restrict those ideas to the knowledge gap alone. For example, in respect of going concern, we did have a number of commentators suggest enhanced transparency, but also more robust challenge of management's assessments, which of course we'll pick up or have picked up later in the issues paper. And as Lynn explained to us in April, the expectations gap was a good trigger for thoughts and solutions, but beyond that, we don't propose to do anything further to refine the description of the expectations gap. And our contribution to narrowing that gap is, of course, set out in the possible actions that we have in the issues paper. I am, however, conscious of Kai-Yu, who's actually right below me in my gallery here, of his comment in April that there may be a possibility for some educational efforts in this area. So perhaps board members will keep that in mind when responding to this particular matter. If we could have the next slide, and then again, please. So this is quite a big area. This was where we asked respondents what they would think would be the best way to reduce the, or to narrow, sorry, the expectation gap. Now, of course, there was support for continued outreach, which of course is already very much part of our mantra as a board. And there was clear recognition of the importance of the wider financial ecosystem, and that other stakeholders in that wider ecosystem have an important role to play in narrowing that expectation gap. And respondents also recommended that the IAASB should use its global voice to encourage other stakeholders to act. There was, however, important feedback from monitoring group members and others that work needs to be done by the IAASB, including that auditing standards need to be strengthened, irrespective of whether actions are taken by others. So that's very much to Tom's earlier point, is what can we do irrespective of actions that are taken by others in this space. The monitoring group and others suggested that we continue to liaise with IAASB and other IAASB working groups, and of course we've already begun those coordination activities. In addition, monitoring group members and other respondents suggested that we look to the work done by others in respect of going concern, in respect of jurisdictions where amendments have already been undertaken, such as Australia, New Zealand, the USA, and the UK. And similar to what we heard in respect of fraud, it was suggested that an in-depth review of the root cause of failures would be beneficial to our work, and we heard similar points on our roundtables as well. Finally, we did have a number of excellent ideas put forward where further guidance or educational efforts would help, whilst not all in the IAASB's remit, admittedly, some of which we could contribute to, including enhancing investors' understanding. So perhaps more to those educational efforts made earlier. Some of those suggestions for additional guidance are also picked up later in the issues paper, such as matters related to the application of professional skepticism, guidance around use of technology, time period for assessment and reporting requirements, and so forth. There's quite a long list there. So we are really into the next slide now, which is what can be done to narrow the gap. And I will say that our possible actions in these slides are obviously summarized version of the ones that you'll see in the issues paper. So the working group will, of course, continue the outreach activity with other stakeholders in the financial reporting ecosystem, including the IAASB, and we're going to cover the IAASB a little bit later in the slides. And as mentioned by Lynn in April, we're looking to prepare communication, in particular issuing a communication from our chair that explains the importance of this topic and the role others have to play as well. As noted in the issues paper, we will of course look to what others have done in this area, including analysis of post-corporate financial failures where that's available, and we'll be working with the fraud working group on that particular matter. Michelle, if we could move to the next slide. So finally your turn. Apologies, that took a bit longer than I thought. So we're now asking the board whether, first of all, the key public interest matters from respondents' comments have been appropriately identified, and we've categorised most of these matters under collaboration efforts. And then secondly, your response in relation to possible actions number 1 and 2. Thank you, Tom. I think that's back to you now.
Thank you. Okay. We'll take comments for the floor on A and B. Anyone want us? This is very unlike this group. Maybe coffee hasn't taken hold. Okay, so you're the first volunteer.
I'm happy to get the ball rolling and look at all those hands that have appeared now. So Josephine and the working group, thank you very much for the work and the summary. I note that you're going to come back on the IAASB liaison, so I'll save comments on that, but I do think it is important that we are sort of proactive in encouraging that. A couple of specifics on the possible action B. I think there's a huge amount of really good work there. I take what you say about how we need to be conscious of what we can do and what we can influence. I do think that piece about the role of management and management responsibilities is important. And I wonder whether we perhaps just focus on the fact that as we currently have it, the piece about management going first and essentially making their assessment of going concern such that the auditor then audits it is the right kind of order when we're thinking about procedures and building on that. And the other point I had was that I think the piece that you have in action 2 around the analysis of corporate failures is going to be really important so that we can understand what went wrong and therefore what the auditing triggers can and should be in that area. Thanks.
Thank you. So I would say that you're a trendsetter in this with all these hands following you. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you very much, Josephine, for your very clear explanation. I really appreciate the hard work that working group is now doing right now. And I have sort of very general comment with regard to possible action 2, and perhaps also relates to action number 14, because I strongly agree with the comment received from respondent that including monitoring group member that IAASB should engage with accounting standard setters. I understand that auditors have important role so that financial statement user can understand the entity's going concern status, and we as auditor want to make a contribution to the public interest by playing that role. But auditors can address most of the issue related to going concern to play those important role only when the accounting standard deal with them. So I fully understand that accounting standards are outside the IAASB authority, But in order to provide viable information to the use of the financial statement and to make a truly meaningful revision to the ISA, I think it is very essential to continue on discussion to ensure the alignment between accounting standard and ISA. As such, I strongly support IAASB's engagement with its accounting standard sectors, especially with IAASB. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay. This is going to be a continuing theme, and I turn back to Josephine on the IASB point.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, absolutely. As we will get to the slide, but of course, I did want to mention that we absolutely intend to continue our engagement with the IASB, and we have been engaging with them. And to that extent, I think that's pretty much why we've managed to get quite a lot of the feedback to the IASB, and therefore that has fed into their agenda consultation. As I say, I'll cover that later. The important point here, though, is that in respect to Sachiko's point, which is important, when we have put forward our proposed solutions, sorry, I've even said solutions now, our proposed actions in the issues paper, we are doing that in the context of what the framework asks today, because we can't, as it were, anticipate what will come down the track from the IASB. We don't know how long, if changes are made, how long that will actually take. It could be years and years from now. And therefore we have to think about what our stakeholders are suggesting in that context. So just to give board members peace of mind, each of those possible actions that are set out, including where we've asked to enhance the standards and the application material in certain areas, they're all in a context of what we know today. There are some other suggestions that we'll go through where we talk about the connection with the applicable frameworks, such as the definitions and timeline for assessment. And we obviously need to talk about that as a board and keeping those connections and collaborations close from that perspective. But just from a peace of mind perspective, and we are collaborating with the IASB and continue to do so, and we are putting forward our possible actions in the context of the framework today. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. There's on that, Josephine. Diane.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine, and to the working group. I found the paper very easy to go through. I think overall, I'm quite happy with the direction that you are taking. My comments are very consistent with Sue. I agree with how you've outlined it. I do think I won't belabor the IAASB discussions. Obviously, what you just commented on was very helpful. I think the other aspect that Sue brought up about the ordering, this is management's assessment, and we'll get into that in terms of the timeline and the time period, but they've got to go first, so to speak, and then the auditor come in. I also think some aspects of the robustness of the audit execution over the forecast that put forth are going to be an important aspect as well. But overall, quite comfortable with how you've summarized it and the possible actions relative to 1 and 2. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Choi?
Thank you. Good evening from Singapore. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Josephine, and the working group and staff. Very similar theme. I think the paper is very well put together. First of all, respondents' feedback very well analyzed and summarized. And it's been really easy just going through the recommended actions and just saying, yes, I agree to most of them. I just make 2 quick points. First of all, in relation to defining expectation gaps, etc., I agree that it has been a helpful tool, but yes, we have used it through the whole consultation process to focus on mind and the stakeholders' mind on the root cause of the gap, but we probably wouldn't need to formalize the definition. So I agree with that. I do want to just maybe remind us again not to forget about that key linkage between understanding the root cause with the exploration of the remedies. And I was sort of reminded of this when I read paragraph 25 of the issue paper that spoke about, even though respondents indicated knowledge gap as a primary driver, the suggested solution were not limited to that. And of course, we take a multi-pronged approach to tackle an issue as complex as this one, but we must not always forget to always go back to the analysis of the whys and what, so that the solution is targeted and importantly, proportionate to the issue. And I look forward to seeing that coming through very clearly in the project proposal. In relation to the IAASB discussion, similar to the rest, I just want to maybe mention here that, as we continue to collaborate and work with the IAASB, and while the standard setting process is ongoing, and as we know, there's a robust due process to go through before any changes can come into effect. And I wonder if there's maybe an opportunity for us to maybe just come together with IAASB to develop and issue a joint authoritative guidance. The extent accounting requirement already require preparers to consider all available information about the future, at least but not limited to 12 months. So perhaps guidance around the kind of triggers that will extend that period of review to beyond that. I don't know, that might be something helpful in the interim. So just putting that out as a suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Roger.
Thanks, and thanks, Josephine, and to the working group. I got that right, and to all the staff. This was an extremely easy paper to digest and to work through, and to look at basically supporting most of the proposed actions. The one thing that really impressed me was the amount of work and the research that's gone into the proposed actions. You've done a lot of work and you've been able to synthesize that very well. I wouldn't spend a heck of a lot of time. I think you've already got a lot of work, and you've got the basis for what you need, what you've identified going forward, so that you can start working on the standard setting solution. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time doing a lot of other research unless it's something that you can easily identify. So yes, you could explore past corporate failures. It's already been explored to a bit. I'd try and do that as easily as possible. Just reaching out to regulators to see if there's any of those failures which they can identify which have an impact on the auditing standards, as distinct from deficient performance, would be beneficial. But very supportive of your approach in one, very supportive of your approaches going through in possible action two. In fact, mostly supportive right the way through the paper. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Julie?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine, for the paper and your task force and the staff that pulled this together. Love the use of the check marks and the little boxes. I see that's consistent with the fraud working group as well, so like that. I would say, without belaboring the point, Josephine, I had key points that I wanted to raise was the coordination with that IAASB. So you've covered that already. Diane and Sue have also mentioned about the ordering of ensuring that we are auditing management's assessment. So you can add that to one of my other key points. And I'm broadly in agreement with both your actions in 1 and 2. I think the root cause is sometimes a little tricky, depending on who you need to go talk to. So you mentioned in the paper around talking to academics or others that might have some insight into some of the root causes. I think that's probably a little bit of an easier route sometimes to get that information. So I would encourage you to do that. And to Roger's point, making sure the focus of those discussions are around the auditing standards, so you can move on to what the IAASB can do from a standard setting perspective. But overall, and I'll also say overall on the paper, very supportive of where the task force is heading.
Thank you. Kaiwe?
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon. Josephine, thank you very much for the work you have done, you and your team and the staff. The material is very well prepared, and this is a very, let me say, hot topic, the going concern issue. My quick response to action 1 is that in relation to the expectation gap, and in particular in relation to the knowledge gap and reasonableness gap, I believe the IAASB does have a very important role in contributing to the education of users and international level of the role of those charged with governance, management, and the auditors in relation to going concern, and also the limitation on the ability of the auditor to predict the future in relation to going concern matters. In particular, that audits will never be, and I think we all agree, will never be a guarantee about the future. So consequently, why the IAASB need to dwell on the definition surrounding the expectation gap, the IAASB does need to convey the general meaning to stakeholders. That's my first comment. And to the possible action number 2, I also have a very brief comment, which is very in line which you, Josephine, and all the other colleagues have mentioned before. In my view, the IAASB also needs to liaise with the accounting standard setter like the IASB, and from my point of view, the bodies of the European Union, to encourage these standard setters to clarify and augment the responsibilities of management and those charged with governance in relation to going concern. These have been my 2 responses. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Todd. Lynn?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Josephine, and the working group and the staff. Angela, I can see your fingers all over this from the fraud paper, so well done. In terms of the first question you asked, I think it's a very good summary of what I've read in those 85 letters. And I think your analysis of the key public interest matters is a good one. So my answer to your A question is yes. In terms of the possible actions, it would be very hard for me to disagree with action 1. On action 2, I agree with all the alternatives that you have set out there. I think in terms of the educational efforts, the outcome that we're looking for from both fraud and from going concern are very similar. So, and there are examples that we can use in that education. So maintaining the parallel developments that we've got going between fraud and going concern at present, I think will be important as we move forward. Finally, on the rest of the paper, I'm pretty much where everybody else is. I'm largely in agreement, so don't have a large number of comments going forward, but that doesn't mean I don't support what's proposed. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. Kai Morton.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Josephine, and the group for the papers that's been prepared. I think they provide a good summary of the input that we've gotten, and also that you summarized the public interest matters in a good way. So on A, yes, I do agree on that, and I think also on possible actions 1 and 2, I agree with most of what's been said so far and what you're outlining. So I won't repeat that too much, but I think collaboration and working together with IAASB is key in one of these in this area. So thank you.
Thanks, Kai. Imran, are you there? I have a picture of your printer. Imran?
No.
Hello?
Imran's printer wants to make a point on the going concern project.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Imran. Maybe that you're having technical problems. Len?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the working group. Excellent paper, very easy to follow and read. Just want to echo what Lynn said about some synergy between the fraud working group and the going concern working group, and also emphasize the focus on what we can do as a standard setter. There are certain things we cannot do, but of course we will share information, engaging other stakeholders. One additional comments I want to talk about is the external engagement with a key stakeholder. just looking at some of the securities regulator, also stock exchanges, there might be initiatives or actually certain regulations at the local jurisdictional level. There might be some work has already been done on going concern, whether in terms of disclosure or certain responsibility placed on management, and also some of the securities regulators and stock exchanges might require auditors to do additional procedures. So this is something that perhaps through IAASB or doing something a little bit more with the National Standard Setter to follow those development, because IAASB has a huge interest in the IASB going concern project. So some of the jurisdiction work might factor into the input into the IASB project might ultimately impact us. So encouraging outreach to the securities regulator, whether it's through IAASB or some of the larger stock exchanges and the national security regulators. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Imran, are you back?
Yes, it's me now and not my printer speaking.
I thought it was a powerful AI-led.
Yeah, I tried to get HP to speak, but it doesn't speak yet. Good afternoon, everybody from Johannesburg, and great to be with you. Great to hear your opening remarks, Josephine, and a particularly interesting topic and really great issues paper. As one regulator to another, recognizing very much how big an issue to us this is. It's extremely important to national standard setters, and in the South African context, where the question continues to be asked, where were the auditors? This question is posed every time in the context of the going concern issue. And so I think that as a general comment, what I was looking to see in the issues paper was the need for our board to be seen to be doing something tangible in this area. Or else my stakeholders say to me, it'll be done for us. Of course, what we gather from the issues paper is that a number of places in the world, others have taken the lead on us. And so it's important that we, again, resume our leadership position. With that, I have a fairly lengthy first comment to make and maybe shorter comments later on. And the first one was in relation to a quick first comment on the analysis of respondents. I noticed, Josephine, that we got a response from Turkey, and but that Turkey's been classified within the Middle East Africa region for purposes of this document. And the organization in question is actually a member of Accountancy Europe. So I wonder whether there may be a particular reason for that, or is that just a classification error that will be rectified in the further analysis. But what I want to talk about was the very helpful way in which each section of the issues paper summarizes what's happening in different countries. But I feel like we're missing a big trick here, because for many of us who are familiar with the topics, reading them all in one place was useful, but we've heard about many of these things before. We've heard about what's happening in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, in the UK. And I think that in the next iteration of what we're doing, the real value about why we would talk about other countries is from knowing the things such as, are there common recommendations or reforms? So is Australia doing the same thing as the UK? So that would give us a sense of, is there some momentum about a particular reform? Or are there any common timeframes that they are all chasing, that they all hope to have something done by a certain time, which will have an impact on our timeline of work that we do in this area? I think also it would be useful to know thematically from what is happening across the world, whether their focus is typically on this area of additional requirements, whether their focus is on transparency and reporting, or whether their focus is on coordination. Because we seem to have a massive focus in our paper on coordination, yet I would see other countries seem to be doing work with less being said about coordination with accounting bodies in their countries. And they're doing stuff, but I may be drawing that conclusion incorrectly at this time. And from this kind of exercise, have they identified common pitfalls? Because we have those standard setters and regulators from those countries, either around this table or around the NSS table or very close close to us. And I think that it's also useful to understand this point, because we seem to be placing a great deal of hope in this, that there will be broader reform around other people's responsibilities. And I'm really keen on understanding whether in other countries, whether the reforms related to going concern are inextricably linked to other reforms, or they audit reforms proceeding on their own in relation to going concern. Because that could affect our thinking around this and us being seen to be on the right track or the wrong track or the slow track or the fast track. So that's my comment about what's going on in other countries. I think the question in relation to public interest issues, I'm going to comment on the very handy summary you've included in the paper. And the first one is about the subject of collaboration. I think that one is we have, I think, if I use your words, Josephine, you use the words, I think, years and years, or you use the words can't hold out hope for years and years, either one of those versions you use. And I share that comment. And I think that putting that first runs the risk of us saying we will wait or we can't do what we need to do until others have done so. And I appreciate that others have to do something, but that there's a need to balance that. I think that one of the things we learned from previous crises was when auditors blamed accounting rules. And crucially, as you highlighted, Josephine, in your remarks, we have to work within the current framework. I was the recipient of a IAASB update yesterday, and looking at their forward calendar, it's hard to imagine where, before I retire, they're going to open this project, around going concern. And so I accept very much that that's a nice to have, but for us to be seen to be doing something, we're going to have to work within the current framework. A really strong message around supporting that and underplaying this message around collaboration. The second idea for me, which comes through a little bit less strongly in the public interest issues, but is our key learning, is the lessons around independence. That at the heart of bad going concern calls are either conflicts of interest or long association issues. We have too many of examples of them to ignore. And so we come up with things like how team composition plays a part in this, how familiarity risks play a part in it. And I know we're using the word professional skepticism in the paper, but I think it's a little bit more direct, that these are the actual issues that put a fresh set of eyes on it. They're likely to be more critical of the issues than the person who's been there for 17 years and tick that off and sign that off every year. I think the last point around the PI issues and the way the table is structured, I believe strongly that the point you're making about the ISAs being fit for purpose is an important PI issue. It seemed to me, though, that the table on the right-hand side, which captures the key messages, was a little bit misaligned for the moment with the extent of responses we were envisaging in this issues paper. So I think the issues paper goes further than the public interest table does for the moment, but maybe that will evolve as we see further versions of this at future meetings. Lastly, someone said before me that we should start working on solutions because we have so much that has come back from this. I think that's a very good message for us. And so we have committed to some long-term calendar. I think it was Roger who said so. We've committed to some calendar published in a work program, really support that we continue doing work in that area and not stall for any reason on this because more research needs to be needed. Other than what I'm describing, let us not get left behind by standard setting initiatives in other countries and describe it in the way I've proposed. Thanks, Josephine.
Thank you, Imran. Eric.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Josephine, the working group, and all the support. I found the paper, like others, very easy to read. I found it very proportionate in terms and balanced in terms of the way you've presented all the feedback and how to address the points raised. On this first two actions, very supportive of the positions taken. I guess I have a couple of comments. One is, there's a lot of talk, if you will, about, well, the IAASB should be doing something and we should be educating people, and what is our remit and what is our role. I really think it's incumbent on all of the board members to play a part in that effort. And I think this may have been done before, but I'm not sure, is whether materials could be developed that could be used by members in their individual jurisdictions to support the work of the IAASB in explaining the role of management and explaining the role of those charged with governance, and where we as global standard setters feel the auditor's role fits in with that. I think we need a broad-based outreach effort globally to sort of make a difference here. And I know that we've spent a lot of time focusing on the IAASB, and Len mentioned IOSCO. I think we really need to think about who are some of the global bodies that can influence the role of management and those charged with governance as part of this effort, because again, I think they have a role to play, and we can hopefully reach and collaborate with some of these bodies that can affect the roles played by management and those charged with governance. So those are the only points I wanted to make really on these actions. I'm very supportive of the direction of the paper. I thought it was very well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Josephine, thanks a lot for the papers. As others mentioned, has a lot of good information, a lot of things that need to be done. I very supportive, not only on this section, but across the paper. I think at this stage, it's very difficult to object the way forward. I know things will move probably in more detail as the project proposal is being developed and other discussions are taking place. I was just thinking that this project is very similar to what we saw a couple of weeks ago with the fraud paper. And I think that many actions need to be coordinated somehow in terms of potential changes to requirements, guidance, or other type of papers between the two projects. And because that will really enhance the end product that will be used in practice and by others, and if we have common things that could be tackled together somehow, I think that would be very helpful for all of us. That's all what I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. I just wanted to add a couple of remarks at the end. I'm very supportive of how the working group has framed this. But I just wanted to say, in the way that we articulate public interest issues, I think it's really important for us to be a lot clearer about the specific public interest issue we're addressing, particularly as we go into a post-reform environment where we have a public interest framework. So I would just highlight, for example, keep it fit for purpose is sort of a slogan. But in fact, what we're talking about here are two big issues here. One, I think, is something that we've been trying to do all along, is an integrated set of standards aimed at improving audit confidence and audit quality in a particular area. And so this is what comes up with our linkages to 315, QM, and other standards. And we should say that. And our standard, we then to be judged is, are we emphasizing that point? Because I think sometimes we get in the trap, and others get in the trap of looking at each standard in isolation. And what we've been trying to tell people for some time is that our standards work in its totality. And what we're doing now is effectively considering a modernization to make sure, as we've updated other standards, going concern is also up in its game in terms of audit quality. Secondly, is really about addressing specific issues as it relates to the performance, the expectation gaps. Some of it may be performance gap and some may be evolution gap, but there were 2 points below, and as some others have advised, that there may be more issues among them. So I'm generally support, but I think it's really important now more than ever, when we articulate public interest issues, we're really specific about what it is, because then our accountability at the end of a project could be properly measured. And so that's my first point. On the second point, it relates really to the first one, and I think people are now in agreement. We must do what we can do in our own control while engaging others in the ecosystem. But I think there's something about, from a public interest standpoint, there's some urgency about that first part of the phrase, and some recognition that we are doing the other part of the phrase. I think Eric is quite right. We will have a collective responsibility to all of our stakeholders, both on this board and in our other lives, to make sure the proper integration of approaches are done. So that just really about public interest issue articulation. I'll pause there. I don't know if people have reaction to that, but Josephine, I turn it back to you. That's the end of the first round. You got a lot of support for the approach of the working group. I think you clarified things in a really helpful way for people too, as well as it relates to the IAASB as well, and the current framework. Josephine?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, loud and clear. Thank you, everybody, for all your support and all your comments. I'm going to start with a couple of things I just wanted to feed back. Fernando and his lovely birds, along with Lynn, have made a good suggestion that some of these actions could be coordinated with the fraud working group. And yes, that is right. In fact, there are quite a few where it's not necessarily clear where actually it would be better for us to work together, both as particularly where we're trying to achieve the same goals. In terms of Sue, Diane, Julie and others, the greater emphasis on the focus on management first, yeah, certainly heard that loud and clear. And whilst that wasn't articulated during the slide presentation, I apologise, but we did actually pick that up in our issues paper, and we'll certainly keep that in mind in terms of our proposed actions going forward. I'm going to cover everything. Education to stakeholders on the expectation gap. Caillou, yes, thank you for that. We will of course keep that in mind in terms of our possible actions. And also Len and Eric look to the work of securities regulators. That's going to be part of our coordination activities and our outreach going forward, and also to Tom's point, in terms of actually maybe setting up materials so all board members can be involved in this. So we'll take that away and think about that a bit further. Apologies, I'm not picking up on everybody's points, but I do have them. Imran, you asked the question, are some of these recommendations or reforms going on in other jurisdictions? Are they as a result of other reforms and connected to other reforms, or are they carried out independently? We can dig a bit deeper into that, but certainly the recommendations in terms of looking at what others have done in terms of changing requirements and application material, enhancing requirements and application material, that work has been done, and in some cases a while back. And but we will have a deeper dive into that. The other point that you made in terms of the category of Turkey, the team have got back to me on that and said that they will correct it. It is usually classified as part of the EU region, so we'll fix that. Apologies for that. And then also you mentioned the interplay with ethics, and yes, we'll certainly take that on board. We are coordinating even, I'm not going to be able to say it now, with IS, but that's certainly something we'll take into account when we're thinking about what are those causes. And also the other thing I wanted to mention was Roger's and others' caution on lots and lots and lots of more research. It may not be necessary to go further, but perhaps what I heard was actually make it more targeted. So Julie mentioned in that regard, focusing on the auditing standards when we're looking at what has come through that system, as it were, and also looked at others because as you know, that not everything is available to us. Not everything's available to those who are actually performing the enforcement. So I'm just making sure I've got everything that I can. Oh, Chumwee, you did also mention that in our responses, let's not forget, in fact, let's not forget that our responses need to be proportionate to the issue. I think that's probably it, Tom, in the sense of just capturing some of the key points that we've got. But of course, we have got all the comments that the board members have made. So with that in mind, is it okay for me to plough ahead?
It is okay.
Okay, so we're now into the next slide, please, Michelle. All my papers. So this is question 3A of the discussion paper. Time to roll up some sleeves here. So this one asked respondents if or whether there should be enhanced or more requirements regarding going concern. And overall, more respondents than not encouraged enhanced or additional requirements. This also came through in responses to other questions, of course, such as those in relation to the expectation gap. So the key topics that I'm next going to cover will be enhanced linkages, professional skepticism, more robust challenge, and terminology. So if we move to the next slide, please. So similar to fraud, of course, there are a number of comments that linkages to the ISAs could be improved. And that was also to Tom's point in terms of getting the articulation of our public interest matters correct here. And this is about having that integration and having a clearer link between the requirements in 315 and the auditor's evaluation of management's going concern assessment, noting areas in particular where the relationship could be improved, such as the auditor's understanding of the business model, the objectives, the strategies, and of course things like the nature and extent of oversight of management's assessment of going concern. In terms of ISA 540, and this is also linked to professional skepticism and a more robust challenge, there was call for better links to ISA 570 to the work performed in ISA 540 in relation to management's methods, assumptions, and data. In this respect, some respondents actually said that what they wanted to see was similar requirements in ISA 570 in this area. There was a wider point that an improvement in risk assessment procedures in ISA 570 linked to the work in 315 could result in earlier identification of situations where management has not taken appropriate steps to address the basis for their going concern assumption. And also greater work effort in the assessment when we're looking at the going concern indicators was thought warranted by monitoring group respondents. We also heard what other jurisdictions have done in this area to Imran's earlier point, and we got lots of good information from academic research about going concern indicators in respect of events and conditions. So accordingly, in this respect, the working group recommend a number of actions, both in terms of standard setting and in developing guidance, and those that we believe could address stakeholder suggestions, as well as building on what we already have in ISA 570 in respect of going concern indicators. We have the next slide, please. Professional skepticism. A number of respondents commented on the need to strengthen ISA 570 in respect to professional skepticism. Respondents highlighted a number of areas where improvements could be made, and actually they called on the work that the IAASB have already done in this area. We did, of course, receive an important reminder from our national standard setter colleagues that simply using the term professional skepticism in the standards is not necessarily going to change behaviour. It's back to peppering it throughout the standards. This overall feedback is echoed as well in our outreach activity, including that with CPAB, who also identified opportunities where professional skepticism can be improved, and you can see that in their 2020 publication. So we do recommend standard setting activity in this area as identified by respondents. And of course, as part of this work, we will collaborate with the Professional Skepticism Working Group. And we also intend to collaborate with the Audit Evidence Working Group and the CUSP Working Group, because some of the comments were around using different terminology to change behaviours in terms of skepticism, and also in terms of the auditor's bias when they're obtaining audit evidence. So that was an area that we felt would be, we would need to talk with the Audit Evidence Working Group about. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So more robust challenge of management, keeping you on your toes. This is possible action 6 ahead of possible action 5, because we did some jiggery pokery with the issues paper and forgot to change the numbers, but there's nothing more to it than that. It's just apologies, they're out of order. So as mentioned earlier, I'm very much tied with enhancing linkages to the standards and enhancing professional skepticism. There was a call from respondents to enhance the requirements so there would be a more robust challenge of management. And of course, to Diane, Julie's and other points, this is about, management goes first. It is their assessment and it's the auditor's evaluation of that assessment and more robust challenge in that regard. So there were various suggestions put forth by respondents, and that's on drawing on a wider range of information, for example, considering the need to use experts, greater guidance on how to perform the evaluation, and greater effort in assessing the methods, data and assumptions. Input from our other information gathering activities was consistent with this feedback, and CPAB also noted areas of good practice in this area in their 2020 publication. Accordingly, similar to possible action 3 and 4, the working group do recommend a mixture of activities here, some standard setting activity, as well as the development of guidance to enhance the rigor of the auditor's evaluation. If we could move on to the next slide, we'll just have one more slide before we get to the question. And this is about the terminology in ISA 570. Now, there were a number of comments about the definition of material uncertainty and the need for a better description or definition in order to improve consistency of understanding. Information from other information gathering activity was also consistent with the view that greater clarity is needed in this area. It was also noted that there is need for guidance on the measures, assumptions or judgments used to support the terms, particularly in relation to the term going concern or in relation to the term significant doubt. But also noted by respondents, the working group are cognizant of the importance of alignment with accounting standards here. And I mentioned at the beginning, this is one area where we really have to collaborate or stay very close to what we have in our frameworks. But that said, we would like to still explore possible standard setting activity in relation to the description of these terms, because that was primarily the feedback that we received. And also we'd like to consider scope for additional guidance or education in respect to terminology. In addition, we did hear from respondents in relation to this particular question that ISA 2410 would also benefit from revision to clarify auditors' responsibilities related to going concern. But of course, this is outside the scope of this particular project. We have, however, as you know, included ISA 2410 in our work plan survey as a possible topic to include in our framework for activities. Okay, so we are on the next slide now, and it's over to you. It's whether the key public interest matters from respondents' comments have been appropriately identified. And notwithstanding Tom's comments there, this is where we had them categorized under skepticism and keeping ISAs fit for purpose. And then possible actions number 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is the linkage, skepticism, terminology, and robust standards, robust evaluation. Thank you, Tom, over to you.
Thanks. I won't repeat my comments on each round. First volunteer. Julie.
I'll go first. Thanks, Josephine. In all of these areas, Josephine, I think what you're asking us is if the working group can continue to explore, and I would be supportive of the group exploring. A couple things I noted that maybe just caught my eye. In the professional skepticism topic, I noted in the paper there were some suggestions around bringing in language like we had in 315 around obtaining evidence that's not, just corroborating, but looking for contradictory potentially. The stand back, I just maybe caution that, and it's a little bit to Tom's comments around making sure we're talking about this ISA as a suite of standards as opposed to putting these concepts in each individual ISA, because I do get concerned as we start to do that I guess one, could there be a perception that the ones that don't have it is a place where you wouldn't apply that concept? And then two, should we be thinking about this in totality? And because I suppose if we stood back and wrote the IAASB today, we would probably bake that into an overarching requirement as opposed to each IAASB. So that was just one that caught my eye, just to keep in mind. And then the other one, as you think about standard setting with the group, making sure we remain principles based or risk based, and so that things can be scalable to all audits. Those are the only things I wanted to highlight. Thanks, Josephine.
Thanks, Julie. Sue?
Thanks, Tom. Same comment as Julie about scalability, actually, as we think through. And I had a general comment on the linkage piece as well, which is, I'm not quite sure I understand completely what's meant by linkage. And I think we've got some standards that are referenced there that are still at fairly early stages of adoption. If we mean repeating what's in another standard, I wonder how helpful that will be. I think, Josephine, you said something about similar wording or something, so maybe it's about shaping things. But perhaps as part of the process of thinking of next steps, there is a challenge there about thinking about whether guidance, particularly in relation to some of the newer standards, might achieve the same objective without necessarily opening up a standard simply to repeat something that's somewhere else. And then I just finally, on the terminology, I agree with the proposed action on ISRE 2410. It's an important standard that does need some action. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Kaiui?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks again, Josephine, for the presentation. I will start with a comment to the possible action number 3. I agree that the IAASB should explore enhanced linkages between the standards. However, I would like to remind the board that users of the IAASB are required to understand and apply all of the standards. Increasing linkages may also increase the complexity of the standards. In addition, the cost of any additional requirements needs to be balanced against whether or not the improvement in order to performance is just marginal. Then my comment to action number 4. I agree with the IAASB exploring these enhancements of the exercise of professional skepticism. However, the use of stronger language, such as challenge, should be reserved for situations in which auditors' request for more information from management has resulted in management providing information that, upon considering it, auditors consider such information is being biased. And then my reaction to action number 6, and then I come back to action number 5. While I agree that the board should explore enhancing the rigor around auditors' evaluation of management's going concern assessment, in doing so, the IAASB needs to consider whether, in some cases, where, for example, the entity has little debt, has strong cash flows and good earnings, it is necessary for management to undertake a detailed assessment and for auditors to evaluate such as assessment in detail. Furthermore, if research shows that auditors in practice are appropriately evaluating management's assessment, the question arises whether seeking to strengthen requirements in this regard will lead to any improvement in audits in this matter. And then my reaction to action number 5. First, with little a there, it seemed to me to be premature to add a definition of material uncertainty related to going concern within ISA 570 without having engaged with accounting standard setters at an international level, like the IAASB, the FASB, and so on, to ensure that there is some consistency among accounting standards. creating a definition at variance with accounting standards would put auditors into a difficult position versus management. With little b, I agree with the proposed possible action, and little c in action 5, as noted, guidance cannot be given without obtaining some consistency of the meaning of these terms among accounting standards setters internationally. I already have mentioned it. Thanks for listening, and Tom, I give back to you.
Thank you, Kai. Roger?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Josephine. I think you have identified the key public interest issues. There is a role for standard setting, I believe, coming through clearly. I do take away the message that the common message which we heard which was the standard wasn't broken, but could be enhanced. So the expectation I had from that was that I would see parts of the standard not being changed, parts of the standard being enhanced, and you're identifying the parts of the standard that you will work on specifically. And that will be done in accordance with the framework for activity. So as distinct from a common way of where we throw out the standards 315, 540, this will be a very much a targeted update, is my expectation or understanding from the reading. Very supportive of the actions. Clearly, there are a number of thresholds and action words within there which can be better clarified. And so working with the CUSP working group will be important in those areas. But I'm encouraged I'd encourage you to pursue all of these actions. Thank you.
Roger, thank you. Your summary of it leading towards a targeted update is consistent with my reading to it. All I would say is sometimes that even a targeted update could have significant impacts because it draws attention to the reform effort, and people put extra attention to the application of the standard as a result. Sachika.
Thank you. I have two comments relating to this area. First one is on possible action number 3, linkages. With regard to the linkage between 540 and 570, I support possible action to enhance linkages between them because they deal with some sort of similar aspect that relates to future forecasts. So there are some similar aspects among them. But I think we need to be cautious that there are different aspects as well, because 540 deal with the appropriateness of the monetary amount recognized on the financial statement mainly, while 570 deal with the appropriateness of management assessment of entities' ability to continue as a going concern. So for example, 540 requires the auditor to test reasonableness of the accounting estimate. On the other hand, I think 570 requires the auditor to test feasibility with the management plan. As such, I think we need to be carefully analyze a different aspect that should not be changed as well when enhancing linkage between 540 and 570. And my next comment is on possible action number 4, professional skepticism. I think perhaps my comment is a little bit somewhat similar to what Kaiwe suggested. I understand enhancement of professional skepticism is very, very important. And when considering the enhancement, I think we should be aware that auditors' consideration varies depending on how serious the going concern issues are for different audited entities. For example, I think if events or conditions that may cast significant doubt on the going concern issue has been identified, the auditor will perform audit procedures with more precaution compared to an entity with no significant doubt. So perhaps maybe we could explore, perhaps we could use stronger language such as reconsider, not for every single audit engagement, but for those at certain circumstances, such as when events or conditions that may cast significant doubt on the entity's ability to continue as a going concern has been identified. That's all from me from this year for this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachika. Diane?
Thank you. Josephine, I think you and the working group did a nice job of calling out the key themes that I think I would have focused on. I mean, going concern assessments come down to assessing assumptions many times, and I think it's a bit of a skill to look at those assumptions and determine which are the most significant assumptions. And what I mean by that is the ones that drive the answer, the ones that are most sensitive. It might be a revenue growth assumption. And so I think there's an opportunity with the linkage to also potentially tighten up the auditor's responsibilities. I think sometimes if you look at, and I just did a quick look at some of the language that is sitting in 570 in the application material, it may say things like make inquiries. I think there's an opportunity to maybe tighten that up a bit more. And I know there's some caution about using words like challenge and so on, but I personally do feel that this is an area where the auditors need to do more. And I am sensitive to Imran's comments about long association. I'm sensitive to auditor, the unintended consequences of bias, familiarity bias, where these guys, the assumptions are good, I'm not going to challenge it quite so much. And so I think there really is an opportunity to, again, enhance that. I would encourage you to, and maybe some of this, without going too crazy, some of this might come out in the root cause. But I do think where we tend to fall down is the auditor didn't challenge appropriately and didn't hone in on the most significant key assumptions. If the company says, listen, we're going to get a new line of credit, or we're going to execute some sort of transaction that's going to bring in a lot of cash, the auditor should be assessing the feasibility of executing those actions, not just auditing by inquiry. And so I do think, again, tighten that up and sensitive to the words that we're using, and that we're not putting ourselves in a box relative to the changes that were made with the estimate standard. I do like the linkage back to the risk assessment. I think understanding management's bias and understanding what's going on at the company and what motivates management, because it's possible that that management bias will filter into the assumptions that management uses. So I do think there's a linkage there. So again, I'm approaching this as an auditor. I think there's more that can be done to strengthen the challenge. And I know people don't always like that word, but the assessment, the evaluation, the consideration of management's plan. So I really support that. And I also support the action items that you had relative to the definitions. I do think there is, and you heard this loud and clear through the papers, I think there is still some confusion as to some of the terminology. So really supportive of that effort as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Wei.
Thank you, Tom. So I should have mentioned it earlier, Josephine. I'll send through my comments. I do have some minor comments throughout the document, but mostly supportive. But just want to come in to reflect a little bit on the professional skepticism. And this may be a little bit of a continuation of the theme that Sachiko and Diane have set up, but it could also sounds a little bit like, going crazy, like what Diane has said. I'm not sure. But just in terms of going concern, I think we all know that non-going concern basis of preparation is very rare, and preparers are generally hesitant about disclosing uncertainties, about significant concerns, about ability to continue as going concern due to the risk that it may lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy situation. So we need to recognize that there is a strong motivation for management to justify usage of going concern basis of accounting. And to justify there's no significant concern. So just, I keep thinking about, how do we move the dial a little bit? How do we move the needle? And maybe, and this may be slightly premature and going crazy, but when there are triggers and where there are significant uncertainties, for example, being observed, maybe we could assume that management is biased. So it's a little bit of the fraud standard, the rebuttable presumption. So assuming management is biased going into that analysis, and think about how that bias would be applied in the situation, and then actively develop audit responses to challenge that. And I almost think, to my point earlier, in order to move the needle, you need to potentially explore doing something a little bit more drastically. So that will be something which maybe I'll encourage us to think about a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. Eric.
Thanks, Tom. On action 3, supportive of the linkage, the exploring the linkages, particularly the linkage between 315 and 570. I think there's some obvious opportunities there to bring the two together. On the professional skepticism, action number 4, supportive of the direction. I'm always a little bit concerned about developing new terms and what they mean and how you operationalize them. So I'd like hopefully the working group to consider how to achieve the objective of enhancing professional skepticism without bringing in new terms. I think a lot of what Diane said kind of made sense to me in terms of the direction, but how to achieve that might be quite challenging. And that same comment goes to the more robust challenge of management. What does that mean, and what are the factors that the practitioner needs to consider that would drive sort of changing the approach there? On the definitions, I agree that these are areas of significant confusion around for practitioners, but like others, caution that we don't want to get misaligned with the accounting standards. And finally, just emphasize 2 things in terms of, like, first of all, the scalability, as others have mentioned, I think is important to be cognizant of that. And also, I think, probably generally is just where does the public sector fit into this, and the role of the auditor in terms of questioning assessments in the public sector comes to mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Imran.
Thank you. A handful of comments on this very interesting suite of questions here. Like one of earlier speaker referenced the use of the word linkages as one of our possible actions. I was really curious about what really this means. I think it would be helpful for us to be a lot more explicit about it. I, like the earlier speaker in my own notes, wrote referencing, and I don't think that referencing on its own got us anywhere in relation to what needed to be done here. The second area was this discussion about professional skepticism. I think that we've had a professional skepticism group run for ±5 years, maybe longer. The idea that we have heard many times, let's go back and address PS holistically, which we haven't done. We've addressed PS on a piecemeal basis, standard by standard. I don't see how there can be a case for us tackling it in any other way on the going concern project, because we certainly don't have a omnibus umbrella professional skepticism project going on at the moment. And so the use of the words like rigor and challenge is what I look forward to seeing in it, believing that non-authoritative guidance won't cut it here, because there's no shortage of non-authoritative guidance about going concern. What is really needed is more actions on the part of auditors to do something about it. The suggestion of the working group to deal with that name of that concept that sounds like a milkshake, MURGC, there's enormous difficulty in using it. It's enormous difficulty in writing guidance around it. And Eric provided a necessary caution about we shouldn't unnecessarily change names. I think a fair case has been made about the need to develop a definition here, and that's why it's necessary this time. I have heard a fellow public member and others talk about the proportionality of the actions we propose, and also use the issue of costs of the actions that we're proposing. And I thought that this needs to be responded to in the public session, because it could become an argument that stops us from doing anything. Anything we do is likely to have a cost. Additional requirements are going to have a cost. Ask an investor who's lost everything what the cost is in relation to what the auditor didn't do, and we'll have the answer to the equation. But I want to make this point here, that in the outreach, Josephine, around this discussion paper, we made a particular effort to reach users from whom we don't usually hear, and particularly directors of companies. So amongst the comment letters that we have in the pack, we have, for the first time in my 6 years on the board, a letter from the Audit Committee Forum of Southern Africa. This is the Audit Committee Forum associated with the King Committee. The letter is signed by the CEO, by the head of the Audit Committee of the fourth biggest bank in Africa. Similarly, there's a letter from the CEO Forum advocating the need for stand-back procedures for auditors. These people who are going to be paying for the audit, including CRUF, Corporate Reporters Users Forum, they're not raising concerns about the cost. They're advocating for additional requirements in these areas in very clear words, in these areas and in other areas. And I really think we should embrace it, that actually the audit is going to come at a cost, but that is the cost of greater confidence. And let's be upfront about it when we describe the potential impact when we start drafting a project proposal, because we can't have it both ways. We can't expect the auditor to do more, but ask the auditor to not charge any more for it. I think that would be an unreasonable argument to make. And we should look to what the stakeholders in that space, the ones who are paying for it, are saying to us. And they certainly haven't raised any obstacles in relation to cost, at least as I've read their comment letters in response to the discussion paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Imran. Len?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Josephine. Just a couple more thoughts. On professional skepticism, I think we heard a number of comments so far. But also just think about, we heard something quite similar from a fraud working group, and also from all the evidence. And before these three projects, we heard about professional skepticism coming through 600, 220, 315, 540. So I was just wondering, anyone talk about something holistic? So also Julie talked about, we look at the ISA is one set of standards, all the ISAs apply. So I wonder whether we should again look at how we should address professional skepticism holistically, because when I look at the paper, talk about some of the verbs: challenge, reconsider, questioning. I'm sure we'll all talk about the same type of wordings in fraud, the working group, and also all the evidence project as well. So some consistency, but that consistency require coordination. Then you step back and saying whether we should do a little bit more and look at different strategy as a board, look at professional skepticism. So my comment is not just specific for going concern, but something that it just keep coming up every time we try to update the standards, and the same issue, same public interest keep coming up. So something maybe for all of us to consider. Possible action number 5, but I agree with everything in terms of alignment with the IAASB, non-authoritative guidance, and also the approach on ISRE 2410. But in a perfect world, we're not going to be able to align with our project, with the IAASB project. Clearly support for continued outreach with IAASB, but I would place some emphasis on the second part, the consideration for non-authoritative guidance and education material, because I feel that if we have to wait for IAASB, there's clearly some education material guidance needed in practice. So I have a slight emphasis in terms of the second option we have as one of the action items. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you. You all really good comments. I'm supportive myself of where the working group is headed. One thing about is it's important not to pose the cost element. I have to agree with Imran up front. I think all standard setters have to look at cost benefit analysis in some ways going forward, but certainly imposing a restriction up front on our thinking could lead us to be less open-minded than we would like to be. And I'd like to think that particularly when we've heard from the wide group of stakeholders that at least we'll consider it. And then if we go down the path and think an action may be appropriate, then we'll apply an appropriate cost benefit framework into our thinking. Josephine, back to you. You heard a lot here. Generally supportive of the approach that the working group is taking and framing it with some degrees of emphasis here or there.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you for raising that cost issue, because of course that brings into the point of proportionality, which everybody on board knows is now my favorite phrase of all. So thank you. I did hear caution about bringing the language that should be thought about in totality in respect to professional skepticism. I think with this one, there will be a balance. I think there will be a need to look at what 570 should do, because it's specific to the auditor's work in the going concern arena, as it were, and to some extent to what Diane was saying about the opportunity to enhance the work around the challenge of the assumptions and not just auditing by inquiry, for example. But yes, I absolutely agree with the other point that Julie, Eric and Len made, that to some extent, some of this might be dealt with holistically in, for example, ISO 500, and clearly we'll be working with Sue on that one. I did also receive caution there about scalability and of course proportionality. Might as well say it again from Eric, Julie, Sue and Sachiko, particularly around events and conditions. In fact, some of the feedback, Sachiko, from some of our respondents did talk about where there are financial triggers that might exist in entities because, for example, of their public interest element and because of the nature of their complexity. And then, of course, thinking through the actions, of course, we'll always, when looking at the possible actions, we will think about whether in certain circumstances, guidance would be a better approach in achieving the outcome that we want to achieve, as opposed to just automatically thinking this has to be application material, this has to be a requirement. That's very much about part and parcel of the exploring there. So I heard that caution, and to some extent Kai gave us that caution. I did hear from Kai that potentially I misunderstood, but I did hear from Kai that there was a question mark around whether more robust challenge will actually improve practice in this area or get the outcome we want. But that's slightly the opposite to what we heard from a number of our respondents, including those that have actually done some thematic reviews in this area where auditors have gone above and beyond what's required in the standards. And the one that comes to mind, and there were others, but was the CPAB research in this area and thematic in this area. And we've also done some work in the UK in this area as well, where literally going above and beyond what's required of the standards has actually encouraged more robust challenge and a better outcome of work-wise. Overall, I think the board was happy for us to pursue looking at the descriptions of material uncertainty, but as with the caution that we received, we absolutely understand that we have to think very carefully about this and how it interplays with the accounting standards requirements here. And that's very much what we wanted to make sure was loud and clear in the slides. This is one where we do have to stay close to what's in the framework, but there's still recognition that something is needed out there, and it is confusing. And so what this might look like at the end could also be guidance, but we do want to explore it nonetheless, because we've been requested obviously by our stakeholders and had fairly good evidence that this is still confusing in practice. Roger, on enhancements, yes, I just wanted to reiterate, and I did mean to say that at the beginning of these slides, but I failed to. I apologize. This is about possible actions that are targeted actions, and not the stakeholders were not looking for a full-scale response. But I also, thinking about what Tom was saying as well, that sometimes even a small change in the standards could actually really enhance the activity in this area. And Chun-Wei, thank you. We'll think about that rebuttable presumption about management's bias. That's an interesting thought. Angela will probably tell me off. I don't remember that coming through in the letters, so that's a nice one to add to our collection of things to think about. And yeah, I think I've covered everything I need at this point. Tom?
Okay, ready? 30, an hour and a half into this 3-hour conversation. I think it's a good time for a short break, a 10-minute break. Now, we're not halfway through all the action points. And what I would say is to the next round, I don't want to preempt conversation, but when themes are repeating itself, could you allude to, say, I agree with X, Y, Z, and just make incremental comments, unless you really think it's a point of emphasis. Again, I just want to be able to get through all the issues today. New points, clearly make them, points of emphasis, make them, but we do need to get through all the topics. So we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you. try to reconvene in a minute's time. Okay, can we turn cameras on? Hopefully people come get back. We have hour 20 minutes left. Number of questions. Again, just a gentle reminder, if your point has been said before, you could reiterate the point by reference, unless it's a point of real emphasis to you, and make incremental points. I will try to, for people who've been less called upon first, I will mix things up a little bit too, so you're not always at the back of the queue. Josephine.
Thank you. So now we're in, if you like, paragraphs 94 to 102 of the issues paper, and this is where we're discussing the timeline for assessment. Because in the discussion paper, we did ask respondents for their perspectives on whether a longer time period of evaluation would be appropriate. And whilst the majority of respondents were not supportive of extending the minimum 12-month period, and noting in particular that such a change can only be made in the connection set out in the period under the accounting standards, respondents were actually supportive of exploring a reconsideration of the starting point of the actual evaluation. And that would be therefore changing it from the date of the financial statements, as it is now, to be either the date the financial statements were approved or the date that the auditor report was signed. And these proposals actually already exist in certain jurisdictions, including Australia, New Zealand, the US, and the UK. It was also noted that even if the period cannot be changed, it is worth exploring whether the auditor should assess the reasonableness of the period used by management in their going concern assessment, particularly where circumstances justify that questioning. The feedback in the discussion paper was again consistent with that we've heard in other information activities. So acknowledging again that alignment with the framework is an important consideration, the working group would like to explore standard setting activity for extending the timeline to the point of evaluation, and then challenging the reasonableness of management's, or challenging the reasonableness. I mean, I guess what we mean is perhaps considering a requirement where auditors can challenge the reasonableness of management's assessment period in certain circumstances. But I do want to reiterate, it is not the intention of the working group to explore changing that minimum period to greater than 12 months. That's in the purview of the accounting standards boards. So, and the next point we wanted to talk about on the next slide, please, Michelle, is technology. Now, a number of respondents highlighted areas where technology can be used to advance going concern procedures, particularly around the use of failure prediction models. And that was raised by a monitoring group member, as well as other respondents, including what feedback we got from our academic research. The benefits of the use of technology in an audit was, of course, discussed in the technology roundtable, which you'll all be aware of the feedback from that roundtable. And simply the working group working alongside the technology working group, so Fernando this time, the working group does recommend exploring standard setting activity in this area and opportunities for non-authoritative guidance. If we could move on to the next slide. in response to question A, there were actually quite a number of possible other areas put forward by respondents for enhancements, which of course is all set out in 109 to 122. And also there was specific feedback on introducing other concepts of financial health and resilience into the standards. So respondents noted some additional areas or ideas that are set out in US GAS that could usefully enhance the standards, such as obtaining confirmation of intent to provide financial support and of course obtaining evidence of the ability to provide that financial support, so third-party confirmations. A respondent had a suggestion of where the audit documentation could be enhanced, particularly in relation to management bias, which was Chun-Wee has already mentioned in the last session, and auditor judgment as well in this area. There were also other suggestions to extend evidence gathering activity to external sources, obtaining written confirmation and considering if more work needs to be done in the application material in relation to the public sector. There were a couple of comments that came through from respondents in relation to doing more in the public sector area. On other concepts of financial health, such as resilience, viability, and sustainability, there was very, very little appetite, if any, really, to extend ISO 570 any further. But there was actually support for considering guidance that exists in this area in terms of supporting the auditor's evaluation of going concern under ISO 570, so something to consider. This area is of course one which we will add to our monitoring global developments list, as it is quite a lot is going on in this area at the moment. So quite a lot there that the working group could explore. And then if we could move on to the next slide, please, Michelle, and then one more, if we could. So before I ask the board for feedback on those prior actions, I just wanted to touch on this particular question, which is whether enhancements should be for all entities or only certain entities. And the majority of respondents did note that on the basis that our standards are of course proportionate and scalable, and that enhancement should be applicable for all entities, and also in the sense that going concern is relevant to all entities also. As some respondents did note that certain enhancements might be more appropriate for large entities such as banks or listed entities, with one MG member noting that stress testing for certain entities such as banks could be explored. Another respondent suggested that this is an area where enhancements in respect of use of experts might be feasible, and we've mentioned those in earlier slides in terms of linkages and robust evaluation. So in a sense, what the action here really is to continue to consider proportionality and scalability when considering enhancements, and of course work with the CUSP and the LCE working group as we do so. And we will of course monitor the work being done by the IAASB on the PI project, because something may come from that project that will impact our work in this area. And notwithstanding Imran's earlier caution about independence matters, and of course, we did talk about scalability and proportionality in the last session as well. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Michelle. It's all linked together. So over to the IAASB. Again, whether the key public interest matters from respondents' comments have been appropriately identified. So in this case, we're dealing with the phrase that Tom hates, which is keeping ISIS fit for purpose. Possibly some enhancements and collaboration, and then also your comments on actions on 7, 8, 9 and 10, which of course are timeline, technology, other actions and enhancements for all entities. Thank you. Tom, back to you.
My mother used to always say that hate's a very strong word. I would just say it just requires some further articulation, Josephine. And we're about to do that. Lynn.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Josephine, for that introduction. On possible action number 8, I really support A, and just considering when the start date might be. In New Zealand, we have moved to the date of the auditor's report is signed, and there have been no issues around that. So it has been useful. It would be even more useful if we could align with the IAASB. So accounting and auditing standards being aligned, that might be a step too far, but it would be the ideal. In terms of 8, fine. In terms of 9, just one comment. I was struck, and I agree with your proposal to look at additional application material for the public sector. I was just struck by the fact that the public sector responses we had were actually quite different. So it might be a little challenging to bring all those together, but I still think it's worthwhile doing that. And I agree with both what we've heard in terms of action 10 and what you propose to do. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Kaiui?
Tom, thanks. I will start with the possible action number 7, and first with the timeline for assessment period. I think this is a issue which is in the public interest, and this issue is, in my view, worth exploring without concomitant change in accounting standards. Lengthening the period to 12 months from the date the financial statements are approved will not work, in my view, because auditors would be required to make an evaluation of a period that is longer than management's. Consequently, this action is predicted upon having major international accounting standard setters changing accounting standards or legislation in this respect. My response to little b in this action number 7 is that, does this mean that in uncertain times the auditor may challenge whether management's assessment period is too long? It would be difficult to extend management's assessment period without a concomitant change in accounting standards, as I have mentioned to little a. Then my reaction to possible action number 8, I'm a little bit concerned with the view that new technology will necessarily improve the predictive capacity of going concern assessments or auditor evaluations thereof. In many cases, the issues are not amendable through resolutions by the application of technology, such as whether or not banks choose to extend financing or whether companies' owners are prepared to extend further financing. We should, in my view, be careful about suggesting that technology can solve the going concern issue. Then my reaction to number 9, which is very brief, to little a. I agree that exploring whether written evidence of third-party support is needed is appropriate. And to little c, in my view, the IAASB needs to be careful not to inadvertently include a requirement that leads to auditors because obligated to search for all publicly available information. Yes, and to number 10, Josephine, I'm in agreement with this possible action. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sachiko?
Thank you. I have a comment on action 7, timeline for assessment. I support the working group's recommendation not to further consider extending the minimum period to greater than 12 months, but I do not agree with explaining the timeline for the assessment period from the date the auditor's report is signed. This is because I believe there is some sort of theoretical issue to require management to assess the entity's ability to go in concern from the date the auditor's report is signed. I think maybe this reason is sort of similar to what Sue commented previously about ordering of management responsibility and auditor's role. Because assessment of going concern is made by management, and then the auditor's role is to test the appropriateness of management assessment. And as for the recommendation to explore the timeline for assessment period from the day the financial statement are approved, I understand it is theoretically correct, But at the same time, I think this issue should be addressed by accounting standard setter first, as Kai was suggested. So because it may not be practical in many cases for the auditor to request management to assess the entities going concern from the date the financial statements are approved, unless it is required by the financial reporting framework. So I believe it is very important to acknowledge that there could be cases that the financial reporting framework does not include the requirement for assessment period from the date the financial statement are approved, and care is needed not to create a requirement that is only practicable in the jurisdiction where the financial reporting frameworks require management to assess the entity going concern from the date the financial statements are approved. That's all from me. Thank you.
I think we have to pause here on this timeline question, because I guess I'm a little concerned about different views here, and I want to clarify it. I guess what I hear is that people are concerned and cautious about going down that path, but my reading of the comment letters is a strong view by stakeholders, particularly those non-practitioner stakeholders, that they want this explored. And I think there's a difference between exploration with caution and agreement. And I just wonder if it would be in the public interest if we preempt that exploration of the working group. And I want I think the focus has to be here is whether we should preempt the working group from going down this path because their caution's so great, or we're suggesting the working group, based upon the amount of feedback they've received, explores it, knows the caution in mind, and we would deliberate the pros and cons on it without a sense of where the outcome necessarily will be. And I'd really like to focus on that, and we'll come back to the other issues later. I see hands up. Maybe we'll do the physical thing again. So if anyone has some views that are sympathetic to mine or counter to what I laid out, I'd like to hear them, because the working group really does need some feedback on this particular point, now raised a few times by others. Anyone who has the same concern that I have? Roger, why don't you start us on that?
Yep, I'll start, Tom. Look, I think there was a view to explore. I also think we shouldn't be, there is an advantage, and I come from a country which has the extended period from the time of the auditor's report, and great admiration for New Zealand. There's two ways which we can accomplish this. I understand the constraint. We want management to undertake the evaluation and auditors then to review management's evaluation. And this could be done either through the IAASB or it could be done at a national level. And so our exploration can bring focus onto this particular attention at individual national levels. And I would encourage the working group to explore it, to see what the advantages and what the disadvantages are in that particular area. We've got some countries where we've got the experience where we can actually get that evidence. So I certainly wouldn't close off the conversation at the moment. Thanks.
I saw Julie's hand up.
Yes, Tom, I'm in the exact same place as Roger just articulated. I think the working group could continue to explore it. There are jurisdictions that do have that timing now, and I think that I wouldn't close off the conversation or close off the exploration at this point.
Diane, I saw your hand, the same position.
I would agree. I would say it's cautiously explore. Again, I think it's an important subject. It clearly was important to the folks who provided feedback. I, again, just am in the camp of, I personally don't believe the auditor should be performing work on a period that is different than management. So that is where I'm going to be grounded. So if the auditor's 12 months from February, but management's 12 months from December, I'm going to have a concern over the inconsistent period. But cautiously explore.
And by show of hands, anyone against the cautious exploration of this topic? and I think, Josephine, you get that there are people who were very specific about the caution, and so all those remain out there. Or do you feel like you've had feedback on this point? I just wanted to dig deeper on this because a number of people have talked about timeline, and I just wanted to make sure you got clear signal on this.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful because we weren't actually setting out exactly what we were intending at all by any stretch of the imagination. We haven't even got to a project proposal yet. So it was really just, as you say, and to Diane's words, cautiously exploring this, cognizant of the fact that this is connected to what's in the accounting standards and what's in the framework as well. And of course, Diane's point about management goes first.
And for all those who expressed the caution, note that your views aren't being ignored. It just was the working group has internalized it. I just wanted to make sure that they had permission to explore the topic, which is really what this discussion's about. Roger, I saw your hand went down, but I assume because you were going to talk about this timeline topic. Yeah, great. Sue.
Thanks. And I was going to start by thanking Josephine for the explanation around the timeline piece, because I think that was really helpful in the context. So I'm in the same place as where Diane summarised, and I think the cautious exploration is a good thing to do. Couple of other comments in relation to 8 with the technology piece. Again, support proceeding with caution. I did note, though, that most of the examples were felt like they were more relevant to the larger and maybe listed audit environment. And so I think we need to be thinking in that cost benefit piece around the investment there. And then on 9, just to say that I supported the clarification on third-party support, and it's something that commonly crops up in practice, and particularly actually outside of the larger audits. Thanks.
Thank you. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. I just want to make one comment relative to the technology. I think it's interesting. I think to Sue's point, it may not have broad applicability to some of the smaller organizations. And I was curious about the check mark and the R. I could see a lot of the material and a lot of the considerations relative to technology being an application or other type of guidance, but I wasn't quite sure what the intention was in terms of actually opening up a standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Okay, we got a full round on these questions. Josephine,
yeah,
broad support, got clarification on the timeline, some notes of emphasis.
And yeah, thank you for the comments on the technology piece. And I agree with Sue. I think that was one of the points that came through, whether enhancements should be for all entities. And whilst the majority of respondents said yes, enhancements should be for all entities, this was one area where you could use models actually in those larger listed and sort of banking scenarios, and where the technology would help. So there was they weren't quite connected in the responses necessarily, but it came through from that perspective. And then yeah, thank you for the feedback on third party. I think generally I get the impression from the board that we should explore all these possible actions as well. And I think I'm just getting nods now. Great, perfect. With that, I didn't really have anything else to add to this. Tom, if you're happy for me to move on, I can. Okay, yeah, okay, perfect. So next slide, please. I'm still dealing with the previous ones. Okay, so now we're moving on to enhanced transparency, which of course is one of our public interest issues. And this was quite a big section, and I'm sure when you read paragraph 126, you felt like you were actually going back and performing simultaneous equations when you're trying to work out what falls into those charge of governance and auditor reporting. But great work by Angela in teasing out all those different responses so we could get a bigger picture. Overall, there was a lot of support for enhanced transparency of the auditor's work, but there were mixed views as to where that activity should commence. So we're going to deal with each of those in turn, as we have done in the issues paper. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the first area is, of course, enhancing transparency with those charged with governance. So those that supported greater transparency in this area, including the monitoring group members, felt overall that greater engagement is needed with those charged with governance, particularly around management's or feedback on management's process. Some also suggested that communication should extend in relation to close calls, early indicators of problems, and generally around disclosures. The feedback, of course, was consistent with our information gathering activities, where it was highlighted that more regular dialogue was actually needed here. Accordingly, the working group would like to explore standard setting activity to increase two-way communication with those charged with governance, recognizing that there is a standard specifically related to those charged with governance, and so whether actually amendments might be better in that particular standard. If we could move to the next slide, please. Enhancing transparency in the auditor's review, in the auditor's report actually received much more mixed views than those charged with governance. And where respondents supported greater transparency, there was a greater focus on the interplay between the CAM and the material uncertainty paragraph. Particular an MG member noted that more information is needed about an entity when its going concern status is in the no material uncertainty stage, so that there's less of a cliff edge once it's determined that there is a material uncertainty. There was also a call for the IAASB to consider whether requiring explicit statements on whether a material uncertainty had been identified and on the appropriateness of management's use of a going concern basis of accounting, as well as calls for clarity around the interplay. There was also support for greater transparency around responsibilities of the various parties, and a monitoring group member noted that it may be helpful for the auditor to clearly communicate any specific or general limitations in their audit. However, such communication should not be viewed as an alternative to carrying out appropriate audit procedures. A caution was expressed from those respondents who had a different view, that any future discussion on going concern in the auditor's report may become boilerplate, along with general concerns about the length of the report and the complexity of the report, and that educational efforts may actually be more effective in this area. However, it's taking all that feedback into account from the discussion paper, and of course the feedback in the other information activities, as well as the feedback from the auditor reporting survey, which was presented to us in our February meeting. On balance, the working group do believe that there is a call to enhance transparency of the auditor's work in the report. However, this is, and working with the audit reporting working group, this is really to explore standard setting activity to expanding that informational content in the material uncertainty paragraph, and then also explore other activities where guidance could address areas where confusion has already been cited, apologies, such as the relationship between the CAM, the emphasis of matter, and the material uncertainty paragraphs. Notwithstanding that we also have a number of staff alerts on this matter as well that we would take into account if we were to develop any additional guidance. And if we could move on to the next slide. The last one in this section before I turn to the board is about reporting to others. So respondents also encourage us to think about communications to other parties, such as regulatory authorities, where issues arise, or particularly where management or those charged with governance don't seem to want to take the appropriate action in circumstances. You will also see in the issues paper that the Accountancy Europe publication recommends making early warning mechanisms for audits more effective to help prevent corporate failure, and using the experience that they have in France with this mechanism. And that's all discussed in paragraph 156. In that regard, the working group would like to explore standard setting activities related to the other party reporting, but in terms of the early warning mechanisms, we will just continue to monitor any global activities in that regard. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So here we are. So once again, are the board comfortable with how we've allocated these matters into the public interest issues? and also your comments, please, on possible actions 11, 12, and 13. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There seems to be back. Okay, let's, Imran, sorry about that. There was an echo from my side. Imran, you're first.
Yes, sure. A short response. I'm supportive of the proposed possible actions on these questions. I think it will be welcomed. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Sachika.
Thank you. I have a comment on possible action number 12, auditor reporting. I understand their needs, and I agree we need to discuss and explore increasing transparency in the auditor report. At the same time, I think that we need to also think about the linkage with management disclosure, and I think perhaps it's not appropriate that the auditing standards create sort of mechanism that require the auditor to have a primary responsibility to provide original information about the entity. As such, perhaps I think care is necessary when explore the issue to think enhancement that can be done under the current disclosure framework. But I think maybe it is consistent with what Josephine, you already answered to my comment on action 2. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you, Sachika. Len?
Thank you, Tom. Josephine, very supportive of action 11 on those in charge of governance. Also support looking at perhaps looking into amendments in 260. But one comment I want to make in this area is we need to recognize the diversity of different types of those in charge of governance. Corporate governance frameworks are different in many jurisdictions, and some may have legal statutory responsibilities, some may not. So recognizing that would be helpful. So it's kind of related to your action in 13 in terms of perhaps reporting to regulatory authority when audit committee members are not responsive, or in situation where they don't have the responsibility to deal with issues such as fraud and going concern. In our standards, we seem to think, or actually has a bias towards that those in charge of governance will do a lot in terms of when auditor service issue, but practically it's all over the places around the world in terms of the responsibility and how governance frameworks at work, especially with those in charge of governance. So recognizing that will be good. I think this probably also some synergy with the fraud working group would be helpful. On action number 12, very supportive of the clarification between can and material uncertainty related to going concern. Speaking to a few national standard setters, these questions continue to come up from practitioners, maybe not in the largest networks, but in a lot of small, medium practitioners, those questions keep coming up. So it will be helpful to clarify that confusion and interplay between the disclosure between CAM and the going concern section. And in terms of more transparency, more transparency is also good, but I take your point about boilerplate. So we need to be very balanced in terms of type of disclosure that's being requested. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Yosh.
Thank you, Chair Tom. And this is my first comment, so I want to express my appreciation to Josephine and working groups members. Thank you very much. Anyway, the audit report, I'm very supporting the 11 because it is very important two-way communication between auditor and TCWG. And in about the 12, the audit report is the only communication tool between auditor and users of financial statements. So in order to make the audit report more user-oriented and transparent from a public interest perspective, the IAASB already introduced CAM and moved to proactively provide information about the audit process and auditor's judgments. If so, since the going concern premise is a prerequisite for users to accept financial statements, having the auditor provide the basis for the auditors approving management judges that there is no material uncertainty, especially like cross call, would also ensure the transparency of the audit report and lead to public interest. Of course, its statement should be clearly distinguished from the EOM or CAM. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai Morton?
Thank you. I think when it comes to regards to reporting, I think this is one of the key areas and where changes can actually be made and where the users is asking for more information on how the auditors reach their conclusion. And I think as Josephine touched on, avoiding boilerplate information is crucial. Otherwise, we're just adding text for the sake of covering off a requirement here. But I think this is an area where I really do support exploring possible standard setting and expanding the scope, as there is clearly an ask for an auditor to do more in this area, or probably more to explain how they reach their conclusions. So thank you.
Thank you, Ty. Taioi.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Very briefly to 11, I agree with possible action number 11. So my remark to possible action number 12, I believe that it is worth exploring increased transparency in the auditor's report and how auditors address going concern. But, and I think this is a public interest issue, only if there's a material uncertainty or there's no material uncertainty, but the determination of its existence is a CAM due to it being a close call. It does not make sense, in my view, to address how the auditor dealt with going concern in the auditor's report when going concern is not a key audit matter. For little b, further clarification would be helpful. My last comment refers to action number 13. It seems to me that a requirement is not needed in this respect. Application material can indicate that in some jurisdictions, law or regulation may require the auditor to report to an appropriate external authority. That's all, thanks.
Thank you. Chui?
Thank you, Tom. Just on 12, auditor's report, strongly support B. Through our outreach, we continue to hear confusion and supporting us clarifying that, so strongly supporting that. On A, support exploring, but I almost think that that sentence needs to continue by saying, you know, we will give due consideration to all the caution that's been given around, you know, a few of our colleagues have mentioned boilerplate, length of the report, and to my mind, quite importantly, the value of greater transparency in all circumstances versus what we have now, which is incremental disclosure only when there are exceptions, which some might really argue works well enough in today's age of information overload. So I just thought maybe we can, and of course, I know we will bear that in mind, but maybe we connect that into the action plan. Thanks.
Thank you. Diane?
Yep, very supportive of 11, 12, and 13, and in particular 12B, because I do think there's a lot of confusion out there. Relative to 12A, my only caution again would be any type of changes to the auditor reporting. I would just ask that we consider that the auditor reporting doesn't go beyond what management is stating. In other words, if there's any type of affirmation statement, you know, we as the auditors believe this entity will continue as a going concern, we should not be saying more than what management is saying. I mean, at the end of the day, These are management's financial statements. They're responsible for preparing those financial statements. And so I just want to make sure that whatever path we go down, we are not increasing the expectation gap as to what the auditor's role is versus management's responsibility. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Lynn?
Thank you, Tom. I just want to endorse what Lynn said about those charged with governance in terms of the similarities and the connection with the fraud working group. On the audit report, if we can make it clearer, good, but I am a bit concerned that we would end up with boilerplate. So as long as we I support exploring it, and I strongly support making sure we take a user's view in doing that exploring. And I agree with Kaiui on 13. This isn't, I don't think, the highest priority, and I'm not convinced that it's only going to be applicable to some organisations, and I'm not convinced that we need a requirement in this regard. Thank you, Tom.
So on 13, so 11 and 12, I think people have expressed support for, with cautions and considerations for the task force. I've never heard two people who have expressed even some suggested that maybe 13 isn't an area. Like going back to Lynn, you used this metaphor of a funnel. And if this is a funneling process, should 13 even be an issue the task force the working group considers in developing a project proposal? I just want to guess by a show of hands, who agrees with the assessment of Lynn and Kai, and then we can have some discussion around it, because I think the working group will have to figure out its path forward on this issue. And as of now, I'm not sure they have absolutely clear guidance yet. Josephine, you have anything to add to that articulation?
Well, I mean, that's fine. I understand that some aren't too concerned about whether it's the highest priority. It's not a high priority, but it's a very, very simple thing to do, and we are just responding to what we heard from our commentators, not just in the discussion paper, but external to that as well, who are looking for something, a little trigger for the auditor to remember, well, I may need to actually speak to somebody else about this outside of the organisation, given the circumstances. So it's not high priority, but it's not a difficult matter to address either.
So, okay, go back to sort of Lynn and Kai. This is based upon stakeholder response and a relatively low cost exploration. Do you object to the exploration still, or just to double your caution, Lynn?
No, I don't. It's just when you are funneling and trying to decide where the priorities, this just didn't come in the high priority, and Josephine has confirmed that. But if we can do something simply, I could live with that.
Everyone else can live with that? Okay.
Yeah,
already as we prioritize where we can't do everything in any standards, everything in every standard setting project, you're getting a sense of lower prioritization, but it's worth exploring if it's low cost right now. Okay, thank you all for that. Josephine, back to you. That's the full round here.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of points. We did hear a couple of cautions, thank you, from Kai Morton, Chumwee and Lynn about avoiding boilerplate and thinking about the users. Appreciate that. And of course, the point by Lynn and Len about recognising the diversity of those charter governance. And of course, we'll talk to the fraud working group about that. Sachiko made the point about thinking about the linkage with what management is required to disclose. Absolutely, that's very much part of what we had set out, probably in more detail in the issues paper. Diane, just to confirm, we actually did hear about these affirmations, but the working group didn't believe because it is not imposed upon management at this time, that it was appropriate to impose this on auditors. So we're not pursuing that particular action. We probably ought to put that as a not pursuing, but just wanted to make that clear. But having said that, I do take into account your point that any changes should also be aligned with whatever management is reporting, and that's also very clear. And yeah, and I believe those are the main points that came through. Thank you. So if we could move on to the next slide, nearly there. And then again, so this is the exciting piece that everybody was looking forward to at the beginning, and I've made you wait right to the end. So in terms of our responses to the previous question 4, and in terms of collaboration, the majority of respondents, as well as the feedback that we got from other information gathering activities, commented that enhancements are needed to the accounting standards in this area. In particular, respondents noted the need for more prescriptive requirements on how management should assess going concern. Improvement is needed on management's disclosures, with some noting that the threshold for providing information is still too high. Also, there was a call for greater disclosures about underlying risks and mitigations, and more explicit disclosures on close calls, and more disclosures along the risk spectrum, even when there is limited risk. Now, clearly, enhancements to the accounting standard is outside the remit of the IAASB. We all know that, but we are working collaboratively, as I said at the beginning, we are working closely with the IAASB on this topic. And of course, we will be sharing the feedback we've received in relation to this matter directly with them. Encouraging is that those who've already been able to look through is that the IAASB's third agenda consultation commentary ongoing concern, as I said before, is consistent with the feedback that we have heard. So we're already off to a very good start. And so the action here is, of course, to continue our collaboration efforts and work through our IAASB liaison working group. But as I reiterate, the accounting standards are at the privy of the Accounting Standards Board. Just to pop to the next slide, and the next slide again, apologies. So question 4 of the discussion paper, I said, asked if there are any other issues, and important to us are our less complex entity community. So respondents to the discussion paper commented on situations, particularly for LCEs, where they face challenges. For example, where formal forecasts are just not available or at all well documented, or in obtaining evidence to support management's assertions that the business will survive is based on ongoing financial support from owners that they can't obtain evidence to support. So we talked about that third party intent earlier, and that could be a way to think about this. Also, that any enhancements should of course be scalable, and this is a message that you've heard today through a number of slides. And this was consistent with the feedback we heard at the roundtable, as well as challenges related to reliance on key persons and a general lack of formality. And whilst they were primarily related to feedback in respect of fraud, they were also respondents who said that this is relevant to going concern considerations as well. So accordingly, the working group recommends exploring enhancements to the application material that might address some of these scalability issues. So to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now there's a bonus question here. First of all, do we actually have our public interest matters appropriately identified? Our actions on 14 and 15, and then finally, whether there are any other matters that the working group should consider as it progresses its work on this project, taking into account that I have really flown through what was in the issues paper, and if there's anything else you saw there that you really think that we really should pursue that we haven't put in our possible actions. Okay, thank you, Tom, back to you.
Thank you. I'm guessing this board doesn't want you to coordinate with other standard setters based upon previous discussion. Just guessing. Yeah, you don't think maybe the opposite's true? Yeah. Okay, we'll take some comments on A, B, and C here on as it relates to actions 14 and 15 and any other matters. Okay, Eric.
Thanks, Tom, and as a member of the IAASB liaison group, I read with interest the paper. And normally the responses that the IAASB liaison group developer don't really come through the board specifically, but they do go through the chair and the director. So I was just wondering, is that the proposed direction on this in terms of developing a response, or is this such an important topic that it really needs to be, you know, a more formal letter of some sort? That was just my question. I'm not sure what Josephine was proposing in that respect.
Josephine.
Right, so we do want to involve them. So I'm going to hand over to Brett because he has this all ready to respond to if this question comes up. Thank you, Brett. Your time.
Yeah, thanks, Josephine. Yeah, thanks, Eric, for the question. I think the point here is that we've just got a task we need to accomplish, which is we want to make sure that the important feedback that we got gets into the hands of those people that are most involved in it, which in this case is obviously our accounting standard setting colleagues. So we just want to make sure that we're including the IAASB liaison working group in that conversation when we set it up. It's not so much necessarily decided already we need formal letters, though that may be necessary. We just didn't want it to be two streams of activity going into the same people. Thanks.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. And for Josephine and Kai, I was just wondering if maybe there's an opportunity now that the LC project is trying to be finished over the next couple of months, and see if we could add maybe a question on the exposure papers to get more details on going concern, and see if that issue could be tackled as part of the LC project now instead of waiting. Not really sure what details we have, but maybe there's a chance to specifically work on that now and not postpone a couple of years suggestions for that type of entities.
Speaking of LC, I saw Kai raise his hand, so I'll let Kai jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Fernando, for raising that. I think it's an area where we can consider, but we also need to be cautious not to move ahead of the development in the ISAs themselves. But as being suggested here, it's around application material and maybe guidance as well. So I think it's an area where we can look into and see if it's something that we need to explore further now, or it should go together with this project. Thanks.
Yeah, one of the risks is whether we don't want necessarily to slow you down your LCE work and your work with what we have today, right? I think is the general sense. Okay, Roger.
Thanks. When on both, I do think you've identified the key public interest matters. Comment on working with the IAASB, and Josephine, you and I have tried a number of times over the years to work with the IAASB as to where it is at. What we were hearing and what we've heard from what I've heard from IAASB members, and it's been in public, so I don't have any problem saying it, is that they haven't clearly heard concerns in this area. It's great to see it's on the work program. They have to hear the concerns. So not only coming from the IAASB, but from the auditing fraternity, because a lot of the concerns are coming from the auditing fraternity. And these include people like auditing national standard setters who wouldn't normally respond to the IAASB consultation. So this is a shout out for encouragement to some of those groups to consider whether it is appropriate for them to respond in public interest to IAASB so that they hear, so that we don't have that, so that we don't hear that message. With regards the what you're hearing on LCEs, as long as the message that this is a management responsibility is not diluted. So I would be concerned about what you include in the dilution that this is a management responsibility. We don't want this in any case for any type of organisation to fall back to an auditor responsibility. So I'd be worried about including it in a standard. There may be some way of addressing it for LCEs, but I would be concerned about addressing it. It doesn't mean don't consider it, but I would have problems about potentially diluting the message. I think we've heard the message loud and clear on management responsibilities first, and I would be concerned about anything which potentially diluted that message. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Anyone else want to come in here? Okay, Josephine, back to you.
Great, thank you. So yes, I agree with Roger. We both have scars on our back for driving through the message that more is needed in the accounting standards, but we will continue to fight the good fight as we all do. So yes, if any of the board members can really connect in with your accounting colleagues, and please send those messages, that would be good to hear, because I've also heard that other responses to the agenda consultation have been a little bit on the weaker side, which is not what we would have expected. I understand the point about LCE again, and certainly get the message that management comes first and management's responsibility shouldn't be diluted. I think when these comments were made, they were made in the context of what is required by the applicable financial reporting framework and where they're struggling because management is not really responding appropriately to what's required in the framework. But we'll certainly take care and make sure that whatever that we put forward as a possible solution, it is an appropriate one in that context. Thank you. And Fernando, yes, I mean, I think Kai already responded to you on this. We don't want to obviously derail their project by steering it into a direction which isn't what that group wants to focus on, but certainly another chair that I am going to be connecting with and talking to about that was a good question to raise. The only other point I wanted to make is that there weren't any, I haven't heard if there are any other matters that the working group should consider as it progresses its work. So I just want to double check with you, Tom, that we're good to go, as it were, on part C of the questions.
One last chance on part C. I don't see any hands, so I think that's a good assumption.
Okay, thank you. So then we're up to our final slide, which is our next steps. So clearly the working group, when they meet next in June, will be considering all the wonderful feedback and comments from the board today and collating any other further information from some outreach activity that we still intend to do. For example, Accountancy Europe will be starting to pull together some of the responses to their consultation, which will be interesting and feed into our work. And also as well start to develop our project proposal with the intention at this stage still to present that March next year. And that's it from me, unless Brett or Angela want to add anything else. Then Tom, I've given the board 20 minutes back.
That's great. And
Thank
hopefully
you,
I won't take too much of it. Before we close this topic, I just wanted to give Michael Hiffman or Jim Galkin the ability to weigh in if they would like from the perspective of the PIOB or CAG after observing this conversation.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I've got a few comments on this topic in particular. I think the bias that the board has showed toward action is welcome. I think that the message came through clearly that even though it's a topic on which collaboration with others is potentially very useful, that the IAASB is prepared to move forward and do what it can in this area, and I think that's an excellent attitude to take toward this. I know in my earlier incarnation with the PIOB and observing IAASB meetings, at one point I was quite disappointed that the board decided not to move ahead because action wasn't forthcoming on the accounting standard setter side. So that's still a challenge, obviously, but glad to see that you're working to take things as far as you can, regardless. The PIOB on this topic has developed or set out one public interest issue that we're focused on, and that is that we feel there should be an explicit statement about going concern in the auditor's report. So that's not saying what that statement has to say, but we think that the auditors need to say something about it. I agree with the observation that Tom made earlier about the definition of public interest issues. And I think that if you can be as specific as possible about the issues that you identified, and particularly the goals that you're trying to achieve in addressing those issues, that would be very welcome. And so the projects themselves can, of course, deal with exactly how you're going to address those issues, but setting out the issues as clearly as possible ahead of time would be useful. And just comment briefly on one of the issues that was discussed a few minutes back, and that was on reporting to other authorities if there's a concern about the going concern issue. And I do note that in some countries, the laws for regulated entities like insurers and banks require whistleblowing by auditors or actuaries, and sometimes even by other parties if they have concerns that might affect the solvency or viability of an organization. And those requirements can be somewhat tricky. If there's not protection for the reporting parties, whether it be the auditor, the actuary, a member of management that's not hearing their concerns met, if they don't have legal protection, then it's very difficult to expect them to make such reports. And so that I would say is support for making that item a lower priority on your list, perhaps, because I don't think it's going to be an easy one to solve. But certainly no need to take it off your list at this point. But I'm not so optimistic about that one personally. So I would just make a couple of general comments about the meeting today's and yesterday's. I congratulate both the task force and the working group for the excellent work that they've done, and the staff for the support that they provided, and well-organized materials and presentations, and good work by the chair and the task force and working group chairs in moving things along in the agenda and synthesizing what the members had to say. So I'll leave it at that.
It's always good to get some praise. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your comments, and we will follow through on those public interest issues and clarifying them. Jim.
Thanks, Tom. And I would just reflect that the CAG has discussed going concern as well as this fraud. And the CAG has been supportive of the efforts going forward. I don't have a CAG reaction obviously on the most recent, but I think that the CAG members will be encouraged with what they've seen. It seems like it's come a long way here, and will be looking forward to sharing that with them.
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else want to raise anything before I have a few closing remarks? Okay, thank you. I want to echo something that I've heard a couple times, but really should be said and not said often enough, is to thank the task forces, working groups, board members, staff for all you've done in preparation for this meeting. I thought both days we had great discussions that wouldn't have happened if we had great preparations, but also we didn't have the willingness to challenge each other and have a discussion on key topics. Because you will love to relive these last 2 days, we will distribute the minutes for this meeting in due course in advance of the June 2021 board meeting, and we will get to approve our March, April, and May minute meetings all at once. Just a reminder, our next larger quarterly board meeting occurs June 14th to the 23rd. It's still by a video conference, even though we're making progress towards in-person meetings again. The final approval session, why we're going to next week for LCEs, been scheduled for the Wednesday following on June 23rd. This gives you some extra time to prepare for that. We did not want to have such rapid turn times. Staff will send a note regarding consultation with individual board members as we get closer to the LCE approval, and we'll make sure that you're up to date on the agenda. Materials for the June meeting and links for the meetings will be distributed shortly. Then for upcoming meetings, just so for your calendar notes and for those who follow us, a little bit of change. We're going to do 3 sessions in July, but there is a bonus for doing 3 sessions in July. We will not meet. We have canceled the calls in August and in November. So those are free time. So we figured do some hard work in July and then free up future months in August and November. So Vili, do you have anything else you want to add about future meetings?
Yes, Tom, thank you very much. Just on the upcoming June meeting, I mean, the agenda was posted a while back already, so all board members are aware of the topics that are coming up there. Posting week will be the week of May 24th, with Friday, May 28th being posting Friday. Just on the July calls, Tom did make mention about the 3 sessions. I thought I'll just give a little bit of background to that. So we do intend to post the agenda either today or tomorrow. So that will be on our website. We will send an email to board members as well. One of the topics that we want to bring to the July board meeting is the feedback from the IAASB project on the definitions of listed entity and public interest entity. So I thought, let me just say a few words on that. So as we go forward this year, you would have seen in our work plan, we have added a work stream to consider the implications for the IAASB standards of the final proposals from the ethics board. I think for the remainder of 2021, our focus will be on the first instance to continue to provide our ethics colleagues with input from an IAASB perspective as they move towards the targeted finalization of their proposals in December. But simultaneously, as you will remember, we used the ethics board's exposure draft as part of our information gathering and research activities to consider what the impact of those proposals may be for the IAASB. So we will start working on that in parallel with continuing to give input to them. So the idea is for the July session on PI is to get feedback from the ethics board through the task force chair, Mike Ashley, that will be presenting at the ethics board in June, and then do the presentation to us as well in July, with us providing input, but also to give our board the feedback that we've received on the specific questions we included in the explanatory memorandum. So the reason why I give that little bit of background is for the board to understand where we're going with this project, but also because we want Mike to also present there, it was very much dependent on Mike's availability. And for those 2 days, he's available on July 21, but we will have to make it an afternoon session for the IAASB. So that will be an afternoon session starting at 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock Eastern time. You will see the agenda that is posted will indicate a 3-hour slot. We might not need a full 3 hours. If we see as we go along that we might only, Natalie and I had a quick discussion yesterday. Sorry, Josephine, we haven't touched base with you yet, but we actually feel that we probably only need closer to 2 hours. But we'll put out the agenda and we will see how it goes and just update the board. So that will be July 21st. And then on July 20th, we will have the dual sessions. We will have a morning session and an afternoon session. So that will be the 3 sessions Tom is referring to. So the morning session on July 20th will be on audit evidence, and the afternoon session will be on fraud. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Any questions to Billy on logistics? Sure, it'll all be followed up by email. But okay, I think it's time to bring it to a close. Thank you, everyone. I've now deprived you of a full 20 minutes, but you still have 10 minutes in the bank. Have a great day, and appreciate your continued efforts on our behalf.